an energy crisis, a climate crisis, and an identity crisis. Europe's economy is at a turning point.
I think Europe actually is pretty good at when we have a bit of a crisis to do something with it. It's sad maybe that you need to do it, but I think that's just part of reality.
As the war continues to rage in Ukraine, European leaders are facing the challenge of a lifetime. First, there's the prospect of a winter without Russian gas. Then there's a skyrocketing cost of living, an impending recession, and the economic threat posed by extreme weather. All this happening at a time when the very notion of European unity is in question.
If there's an emergency, who do you call in the European Union? You don't call Brussels, you usually think about Paris or Berlin.
In this video, we'll take an in-depth look at the state of the European economy, its greatest strengths and biggest vulnerabilities in times of crisis. We'll ask what it needs to do to keep up with the likes of China and the United States, and whether national differences can be set aside in favour of a common purpose. That's all coming up on Business Beyond.
First, let's get the basics out of the way. In this video, we'll be talking a lot about the European Union, but also about Europe as a continent. It's an important distinction, so let's take a look at a map.
The European Union is made up of these 27 countries. The United Kingdom used to be an important member, but officially left the bloc in January of 2020. Several more countries are on some kind of a path to membership. These include Albania, Moldova, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Turkey, and most recently, Ukraine. Geographically, though, the continent of Europe is much larger, covering a total of 45 countries, including the western and most populous area of Russia. The European Union we know today has its roots in an economic agreement on coal and steel. In 1952, scarred by the horrors of World War II, West Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg formed the European Coal and Steel Community. The idea was that if countries managed these key industries together, no one nation would be able to build weapons to use against another.
Over the next few decades, more countries joined a club whose interests and identity was moving far beyond coal and steel. In 1993, the single market was launched, allowing the free movement of people, goods, services, and money.
Further expansion followed, and in 2002, the EU introduced a single currency, the euro. At present, it's used in 19 out of 27 EU countries. Since its inception, the European Union has faced a lot of internal division. During the global financial crisis, countries disagreed over how to share the costs of recovery. Richer, more frugal nations clashed with poorer, more indebted ones. Then, in 2016, Brexit. The United Kingdom, one of the most important members of the EU, voted to leave the bloc. The decision sent shockwaves across Europe and the world.
But none of these crises compare to what happened on the 24th of February 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. For the first time in decades, war had returned to Europe. The reaction from the EU was decisive.
And once again, in the center of Europe, innocent women, men and children are dying of fear for their lives. We condemn this barbaric attack and the cynical arguments to justify it. It is President Putin who is bringing war back to Europe. And in these dark hours, the European Union and its people stand by Ukraine and its people.
The EU's immediate response was indeed united, with countries agreeing to impose economic sanctions on Russia and to help millions of Ukrainian refugees.
If you think about Europe on the 23rd of February and today, the steps have been gigantic and the shifts have been huge.
But maintaining that unity has proven a challenge. European countries have different levels of reliance on Russian gas, and some member states have been less enthusiastic about imposing ever more aggressive restrictions on Moscow.
in the first months, we saw quite impressive unity of purpose and also of willingness to put in place the sanctions. But as we got on to the 6th and discussions of the 7th sanctions packages, you can see that the line between political cost at home and perceived impact that the previous rounds of sanctions packages were having in Russia was perceived as being kind of, slightly on the wrong side of what Europeans were comfortable with. And, there was a lot of coverage of some member states, particularly Hungary, to a lesser extent Slovakia and so on, looking for carve-outs and slowing things down. But, I think that there was a general sense that we were coming to the limits of what Europe felt it could sustain politically. Because in parts of rising energy prices and the cost of living, which are not only a result of the conflict, but that's played a major part.
Even before Russia's war in Ukraine, life in Europe had been getting more expensive. As COVID-19 restrictions were lifted, people started spending the cash they'd been hoarding during the pandemic. That, as well as supply chain issues in China, pushed prices up.
But the war in Ukraine has catapulted Europe into a full-blown cost of living crisis. All over the continent, people are worrying about how to pay their bills.
The Baltic states are at the forefront of the problem due to their close trade ties with Russia. But inflation has skyrocketed across the board, hitting figures that haven't been seen in decades. Many national governments have announced relief packages to help households get through winter. Still, analysts believe there could be unrest to come.
Rising bills, protest, discontent, these are all likely situations in coming weeks and months. This is likely to be a winter of discontent.
But it's not just this winter that matters. The war in Ukraine has made European leaders determined to wean themselves off Russian energy for good. Easier said than done.
First of all, it's a large thing to replace, so it's not easy. I think people are making quite large turns in policy to basically throw everything at it. We do coal a little bit, we do renewables more, but we do kind of everything. What I haven't heard is a more structural solution that says, if we have to do it, we will solve the supply more fundamentally, both with renewables and maybe some of the old technology with some carbon capture or something like that.
And that brings us to another urgent challenge for Europe, the climate crisis. This summer, the continent was struck by a severe drought, causing rivers to dry up and wildfires to spread.
The hot, dry conditions put a big strain on shipping. Water levels in Germany's Rhine and Italy's Po dropped so low that larger ships were no longer able to pass through. Farmers faced poorer harvests and higher production costs. Against the backdrop of the energy crisis, leaders were forced to balance immediate needs against long-term climate commitments such as the Green Deal, the EU's landmark plan to become climate neutral by 2050.
So I think some of the energy efficiency conversations that we've been having, that we've seen over the summer, that we're a lot further forward on some elements than we might have been. But I think that what is under threat is the urgency around the implementation of the European Green Deal from a European point of view. This has gone from being, I would say top of the list a year ago, being somewhere a little further down in terms of immediate security needs at the moment for European leaders. And I think that is a problem.
But I think we should go a little bit beyond the present crisis to think, long term, what does this mean? Long term, it means that if European countries and the EU are able to take advantage of the current crisis and use it to accelerate the a green transition, that would confirm Europe's leadership role in terms of climate policy, and it would give I think the continent that step ahead with respect to the rest of the world in leading the global fight against the climate crisis. And that's where Europe should look towards thinking about the future.
And if Europe is to become a global leader in the green transition, it will have to prove that it can innovate. And in this area, it might have its work cut out. After all, the continent doesn't exactly have the best reputation for, well, getting things done.
Sven Smith is the lead author of a research paper about Europe's, quote, slow-motion corporate and technology crisis. It suggests the continent could lose between 2 and 4 trillion euros worth of value every year unless it plays technological catch-up. Here's how he reached that colossal number.
And if you then calculate through sector by sector, what will happen if cars go autonomous and we don't lead in that technology? What will happen if AI becomes the way to do research in life sciences and we are not the leader in AI? And we take that disadvantage, that basically would cut back the growth and prosperity of European firms, and with that Europe, by that amount.
Just take a look at this list of the world's 10 biggest tech companies. 7 come from the US and 3 from Asia. Europe doesn't feature at all. According to researchers, it's not for a lack of ideas.
It's not that we're not innovative. We innovate, we have lots of ideas, we have great talent. That's not the issue. But the scaling is just harder because you start in the Netherlands, in Germany, Austria, Spain. And then when you get bigger, you find it was somewhere else. And then the big player from somewhere else eats it because they already have the larger scale.
So why is it so much harder for a company to expand in Europe? Well, imagine you're a software developer.
They typically have to write the code for every country, not just because of language, which is one, but also some of the rules on how a number is composed in the phone system or in the banking system or something will just require you to write the code a few times, which means that even for the same dollar, you get less output. Yeah, that's just a very basic thing. You might think that shouldn't make a difference, but if you're a 5-person startup that can write the code once and then have a few 100 million customers, or you write the code once and if you're in the Netherlands, you have 70 million. If you're in Germany, you have 70 or 80 million. That makes a vast difference.
As well as having trouble scaling their business across Europe, many entrepreneurs also have trouble attracting investment.
One of the issues we have in the European Union is also because of the different regulations and of the different tax system that we have in the 27 member states, is also quite complicated to fund startups and to attract venture capital, which of course is the basis of innovation.
The EU's linguistic and cultural diversity is often cited as one of its biggest strengths. But it's also the driver of an uneasily resolved conflict between national and European identities. That tension plays out in economic narratives too. The EU is the world's 3rd largest economy, almost on a par with China. But you don't often hear it described as a single entity.
That tendency to favour national narratives over a common European story has implications when it comes to how the continent is viewed on the world stage.
We don't compare New York to Europe, but we compare France to the United States. And France is rather happy because it's a proud nation and it has something why it should be proud. But we shouldn't dwarf Europe by only comparing one country with Europe in total.
But it's not only languages and cultures that make it difficult to class Europe as a single entity. It's policy too.
On the one hand, we have a common monetary policy, but we don't have a common economic policy. Now, with the pandemic, European governments gave the European Commission, the executive of the European Union, quite a bit of power and quite a bit of space to coordinate a European-wide response. And this has introduced some changes with the Recovery Fund, for instance. And what we don't know at the moment is whether governments are willing to extend that leeway that was given to the European Commission in the context of the pandemic, also to address some of the consequences of the cost of living crisis. So, for instance, we don't yet know whether European Commission borrowing will be extended beyond 2022.
While the EU faces a lot of internal debate on issues like taking on and sharing debt, there is one arena where it negotiates as a single entity: trade. The bloc has dozens of trade agreements with countries all over the world. Interestingly, though, it does not have an agreement with its two biggest trading partners, China and the US. Negotiations for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, began in 2013, but were abandoned in 2016 when Donald Trump came to power. His presidency created a tonal shift in discourse that left a once solid transatlantic relationship in uncharted waters.
There's a lot of caution on this side of the Atlantic because I think all governments in Europe are convinced that Biden or a Democratic president will not win the 2024 presidential elections. So what we're seeing is a rather narrow window of opportunity to get some things done. Get some things done is, number one, solidify NATO. And that is happening, accelerated very much by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Number two, the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, I think, could potentially achieve some significant results. But I think also, quite a candid assessment that, the EU, Europe as a whole, cannot put all its eggs in one basket, and that is the American one.
Speaking of not putting its eggs in one basket, the European Union had also been working towards reaching a deal with China. The comprehensive agreement on investment had been 8 years in the making and was supposed to be given the green light last year. But it has yet to be approved by the European Parliament.
I think the comprehensive agreement on investment is dead. China, or better, some Chinese delegations have tried, I rephrase it, some delegations from China have tried to revive it in informal conversations, try to see whether there was a future, but the European Parliament de facto froze the process back in 2021 when the European Union and China had that exchange of sanctions, and the European Parliament has no intention at the moment of voting for such an agreement.
Those EU sanctions she's referring to targeted a handful of Chinese individuals and entities accused of being involved in the mass detention and persecution of the Uyghur ethnic minority in the Xinjiang region in northwest China.
There were very weird sanctions. From the European side, they were quite limited. They targeted a limited number of officials in China, and China responded with these wide sanctions that hit bodies and institutes and single researchers and single parliamentarians. So to begin with, they were very unclear in terms of what to expect from these sanctions, and the fact that they came basically still during the pandemic also means that none of the people who were sanctioned had a chance to test them in terms of, for example, applying for a visa. So we don't know what it means in that regard. What we know is that both sides are trying to get them eliminated.
With Europe's future relationship with both China and the United States up in the air, some economists say it's time to look for new partnerships.
If I speak about new partners in the world for Europe, I think about Africa. Africa is the continent which probably decides about the fate of Europe, the fate of Europe economically, and the fate of Europe is in its role in the new world order.
In recent years, the EU has signed several free trade deals with African countries. Many of them fall into the category of economic partnership agreements. African nations benefit from zero tariffs and full market access in the EU. In turn, they open up their own economies, albeit more slowly, to the bloc. The volume of African-European trade has risen as a result, including in the area of agricultural equipment.
We can export technology, but we should know that they can improve it and that Africa has to improve the technologies because not everything is optimal in Europe. How agricultural products are produced in Europe is not optimal. So we should look for an equal footing strategy, Europe with Africa, and then Africa would become a partner of Europe, not a new colony again, but a partner of Europe.
Whether it's looking for new economic partners, providing fertile ground for innovation, or dealing with the energy crisis, this is a defining moment for Europe's leaders, and one which could see the balance of power shifting between member states.
In terms of leadership, I would say that we're well past the Merkel era in which Germany had uncontested leadership in Europe. With the election of Macron in 2017, the sort of, shall we say, unipolar German leadership was already accompanied by the Franco-German relationship. But I have long argued that with a diverse European Union, Franco-German leadership is necessary, a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition to drive Europe. It has helped Europe overcome some of the gaps that exist within its fold, and I think it really underscores the need for a leadership that is more diversified, that gives a stronger role to Europe's periphery, that also gives a stronger role to the EU institutions.
Italy's recent election of a far-right coalition, known historically at least for its staunchly Eurosceptic nationalist rhetoric, further highlights the difficulty of advancing a common European project. For European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, promoting a common agenda in climate policy as well as other areas is a delicate balancing act.
We must be careful. President von der Leyen is going this way. She knows where to go. She has the Green Pact and so on. She's going about making Europe stronger, but she's very careful.
But how exactly would a stronger Europe look? And what role should it play on the world stage?
There are lots of things that the EU is doing or planning to do on economic policy, which will strengthen Europe's geoeconomic relevance. We're looking at, because of COVID, because of US-China rivalry, also because of the war, European countries as a whole are looking at what areas of their industry are truly competitive.
Speaking of competing, there are some vital areas where Europe already is a world leader. The continent's cities are consistently ranked among the most livable in the world. European nations also dominate the Good Country Index, a measure of a nation's positive global impact in areas including health and well-being, prosperity, and peace and security.
Where we are saying we are more equal and better and all that stuff is that the very bottom in Europe is doing better than in the US, but it's really only the bottom 10-15%. Everywhere else, the wealth is higher in the US. But life expectancy and some sense of social cohesion and so on still feel very much better.
And that's very interesting that the European Union has now a higher life expectancy than in the United States. The United States had led a long time, but its life expectancy is decreasing due to obesity, they eat too much, and due to narcotics. The European Union, as it is today, is in the lead, second only to Japan.
So what does the EU have to do to convince its own people, as well as the rest of the world, that it's a force to be reckoned with?
We need to strengthen national institutions for democracy, processes for democratic participation, and fireproof national democracies before fireproofing the European Union. Of course, the EU as a construct can do with more reform, but you're not going to be able to achieve it if you don't have national politics behind the European project. So we need to think really in simultaneous terms. It's not just about reforming the EU, it's also about strengthening democracies at home. And the combination of the two can help strengthen the EU's performance more generally.
The European project was born out of the ruins of World War II. Now, more than 3/4 of a century later, a new era of conflict and crisis is forcing nations once again to define what it means to be European, and crucially, how to express that identity in a radically different world.
And that brings us to the end of this edition of Business Beyond. We'd love to know what you think about Europe's role on the world stage. Let us know in the comments. And if you like what you see here, do check out the Business Beyond playlist. A good place to start would be our recent video on the US labour market. Until next time, from me and the team, it's goodbye and take care.